Let's see. Uh, okay, so I am going to be talking about, and can you all see my entire screen? Is there like a, there we go. Oh, no?
Yeah, I think it's, I think we can see it.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to be talking about like the archival silences, and specifically archival silences in the entire directory dataset relating to both gender and race. So as we worked with this data throughout the semester, I noticed, kind of calling back to Rosemary's project, the married women in this directory are only listed as information with their husband's entries. They don't have entries of their own. So my initial goal with this project was to bring these women into the data set so that I could then do comparisons across, the entire adult population of Charlotte represented in this directory and do some data visualizations and analysis there. But then as I worked to mitigate this one archival silence, I found more. Some of them kind of bigger than could necessarily be fully mitigated. So they have bearing, these archival silences have bearing on what we can and cannot kind of safely infer from this data set and with what degree of certainty. And they also, of course, on a meta level, reflect the society that produced this primary source. So, yep, all working from the same data set. We've talked about it by now. And as some of you all probably experienced, the complete data set, a little too big for OpenRefine to handle comfortably. So as a first step, since I was only looking at individuals, I just eliminated the business directory, filtered for in business directory, cut everything that was a yes, and then I cut like another 30 that I found just going through the data. Then I divided the remaining data into two subsets, filtering by nulls in the spouse column to create all married men and all unmarried and widowed, which I saved as separate files. So I wanted to create a new row for every woman who was referenced only in her husband's entry. So creating new rows based on existing rows as the end goal. But of course, OpenRefine doesn't like rows, it likes columns. So in order to solve this problem computationally, I had to reframe it around columns. So when we look at the actual directory entries and the data that they encode about these wives, what do we know about them? We know their first name, their last name, if we assume it's the same with their husbands, their title, Mrs., their spouse's name, we know that, he's the guy in the entry, their residential address, assuming it's the same as their husband's, and their race, assuming it's the same as their husband's. Now that is an assumption, and it's one that risks reifying archival silences of its own in the event that any of the couples in the directory actually are mixed race and aren't designated as such. In the interest of having kind of a complete data set to draw comparisons, I did go ahead and err on the side of the most probable assumption, but kind of with the asterisk that all of this should therefore be taken with at least a little bit of a grain of salt. And with that in mind, these half dozen pieces of data that we have about married women actually map fairly neatly onto a subset of the columns from our starting data set. So to prepare the data, I split name into two columns, and then for the sake of simplicity, I also collapsed title and married into one column. That was a bad idea. Shouldn't have done that. Lost some valuable data in doing so. If I were starting from the beginning, I wouldn't do that again, but I did. And that's what we have here. So I did that in the all married men data set and saved that copy so that it would have the correct column configuration. And then in that copy that was still open in OpenRefine, I took the columns first and middle name and spouse and switched them and did title, substitute Mrs. for Mr., clear out in business directory is business, job, company, company details. And we have a data set, all married women. Except, of course, that there were 205 married women already in the original data set under their own names. So I had to dedupe those. I decided that Excel was the best tool for this because rows. I wanted to maintain as much data that, there would be 2 rows with potentially complementary sets of data in them. So I just color-coded the 205 original Mrs. rows from the data set, went down the list, and deduped. There were about 100 duplicate listings. Not 200, interesting. But I also noticed something weird with that. They were all white women. So that seemed improbable. And I took a closer look. And as it turns out, everyone who is marked as Mrs. or Miss in their own entry in the directory is white. So in the original data set, as Isaiah, you pointed out last week, there are a couple who are marked as Miss who are Black. Took a look at that and debugged. As it turned out, those were 2 people with the first name Missouri that the original kind of data splitting had taken the Missouri out of their name and put it in the column Miss. So with that bit of debugging done, it was completely stark. Just, this is what we've got. And talk about an archival silence. And an archival silence that, of course, has bearing on not only what the people who created this primary source thought was worth encoding, but also an archival silence that has bearing on what we can infer from the rest of this data. My plan for the second half of the data set originally had been, oh, well, I'll apply the same column transformations, put widowhood status into the title column, and then replace the remaining nulls in the title column with Mr., because everyone who is Miss will already be labeled as Miss, right? Well, no. So instead, I took the subset of the unmarried and widowed data for which Black equals true and widow equals false, and I went through it line by line. And I added Miss in the title column for every entry with a feminine name. There were about 1,500 of them, as far as I can tell, because names are an imperfect indicator of gender. And again, this is reifying assumptions into the data set. There's room for error. We're adding more and more grains of salt to what we can do with this data set. And even there were 7 people whose names I didn't feel comfortable making any kind of gendered assumption, and so there are 7 people in my final data set with the title unknown and gender unknown. But then, having manually filled in all these misdesignations, I went back to my original plan for this half of the data, and started looking at, populating widow into the title column, and noticed again a couple of things. First, and perhaps unsurprisingly, like Miss and Mrs., WID, only white people, but also only white women. So I was expecting that perhaps some of these entries would be for widowers, for men whose wives had passed away. And so I started going through these rows once I had isolated and faceted them out to see, okay, are any of these names men? Do I need to change that title entry to widower? And nope. So here we have another kind of more subtle archival silence that still is very revealing about the social structure of Charlotte in 1911. The fact that the kind of man as head of household concept was so embedded in the way that they were approaching just social relations as they would be encoded in the directory, that even after death, white men were worth noting because they gave their wives a certain status. That was just very interesting to me. It speaks a lot about the society that produced this primary source. So having populated the title column for every entry in all unmarried and widowed data set, I had 3 now subsets of data ready to be recombined into one large data set. And I went back into OpenRefine and added a few more columns to them to be able to do all of the visualizations that I wanted to do, which I have like 10 more visualizations that I didn't include here in the interest of time and telling a cohesive story. But of course, all of those do have to be taken with a certain, portion of salt, depending on what you're looking at. Because if you're looking at comparing kind of, employment of women by race, well, we're not positive that everyone who's been coded as an unmarried Black woman actually is, etc. So with the business directory rows eliminated and rows for married women added, my final data set has a little over 20,000 people. So it's a more complete picture. But of course, it's reifying a lot of assumptions. And it definitely still has gaps. And one very easy way to know that, deduping the Mrs. rows, where are the husbands of the other 100 of them? They're not in the directory. So this was really useful exercise just for kind of appreciating the need to triangulate multiple data sets. Richard, as you've pointed out with several of these, several of y'all's projects have done that really well. Just the importance of doing that to get perspective, and the importance of approaching any historical data analysis with attention to the data's historical context. It occurred to me that someone who was coming into this with a background, a really detailed background in kind of the history of this region and time period, might not necessarily have been expecting the lack of gendered honorifics for Black women in the directory, but they would have kind of perhaps been more inclined to look for it. And it would have been very easy to miss. And there are undoubtedly other things that I did miss, other assumptions that are reified into this data set that I'm not even aware of. And so just the risk of kind of datafying at scale and the archival silences that can get magnified by that was something that I really took away from that.